everybody. This week, we're going to focus on setting our minds on Christ. And this morning, as we worship, let's not just worship with our voices and our hearts, but let's worship with our minds. And let's set our minds on Jesus Christ this morning. So I invite you to stand, and let's worship the Lord together. Open wide, blinded eyes, giants fall, dead men rise, sickness healed at the mention of you. Sinners' chains breaking free, miracles still happening, waters part, I see mountains move. The power of the grave, but Jesus, open arms on the cross, oh the pain, oh the cost, by your blood, all things are made new. Oh, my chains breaking free, miracles still happening. Nothing is impossible with you. No other name carries the power to save, crushes the power of the grave, but Jesus. Silence the fear in our souls. Our Savior is King over all. Jesus, I can see strongholds coming down. I can see strongholds coming down. I can see Jesus reaching out, reaching out. Strongholds coming down. I can see strongholds coming down. I can see Jesus reaching out, reaching out. Sing as one voice, no other name. No other name carries the power to save, can set every darkness ablaze, but Jesus, no other name carries the power to save, crushes the power of the grave, but Jesus, no other hope, no other hope can silence the fear in our souls. Our Savior is King over all. Jesus, no other name. Jesus.
Come on, can we give Jesus some praise this morning? Psalm 63, 3-4 says, because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless your name as long as I live. I will lift my hands and bless you. So all across this room right now, let's just focus on the fact that we are here to worship Jesus, that we are here to honor him and to submit ourselves and surrender ourselves. Let's continue to worship Jesus in this moment. is devoted, like a ring of solid gold, like a vow that is trusted, like a covenant of old, and your love is enduring through the winter rain and beyond the horizon, with mercy for today. And faithful you have been, and faithful you will be. You pledged yourself to me, and that's why I sing. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Oh, we praise Jesus. Come on, sing you, Father. And you, Father, the orphan. Your kindness makes us whole, and you shoulder weakness, and your strength becomes our own. Now you're making me like you. You're clothing me in white, bringing beauty from ashes. For you will have your bride, free of all her guilt, and rid of all her shame, and known by her true name. And that's why I sing. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. And you will be praised, oh, you will be praised, with angels and saints always sing worthy are you, Lord. Oh, you will be praised, yes, you will be praised, with angels and saints always sing worthy are you, Lord. And that's why I sing. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Oh, you praise Jesus.
God, we praise you. Lord, let that be the cry of our hearts this morning, that you would be on our lips, that your glory would shine in us and through us. And Lord, even this week, Lord, set our minds on you. Lord, that we would have no distractions, nothing in our world, nothing in the world that would keep us from and hinder us from you, Lord. You alone deserve all the glory, all the praise. So, Lord, be glorified through us. In your name I pray. Amen.
It's good to see you this morning. I'm going to ask you to do something. I want you to turn to the person on your left. All right, turn to the person on your left. All right, and the person on your left at the end has to actually turn and look at you too. I mean, ultimately, we don't want to look at nobody, right? So I want you to turn and look at somebody, either on your right or on your left. How about that? I want you to look him in the eye. Caleb, look him right in the eye. Look him right in the eye. And I want you to look at that person, and I want you to take turns. I want one of you to say, it's time to prepare your mind for action. Go ahead and say that. All right, that's good. Now, I want the other person, you're still staring in each other's eyes, right? You're still stare at one another. Look at the other person, and the other person, I want you to take an opportunity to look into that person's eyes and say, prepare your mind for action. All right, that's good. That's good. These first 2 weeks of the semester, that is exactly what we're doing. We're taking Peter's instruction in 1 Peter 1:13 seriously. That one of the central tasks, the call of the Christian, is to prepare our minds for action. Thinking about the Christian faith, living out the Christian faith requires the discipline of the mind. And so in this first and second week of the semester, we're focusing our attention on how, last week, we can begin to deal with the distractions in life that keep us from really thinking seriously about matters of faith and practice. This week, we begin to be a little bit more constructive. All right, to say, once we begin to clear life of distractions, where we've got time to truly think and live into faith, how do we begin to think Christianly? How do we begin to engage, think, and live all of life by seeing it through the truth of the Christian story? How do we do that? And so this week we begin to put that kind of thing before us, explore it, but more so, not just to think about it, with an eye to how we can actually live faithfully in the world with the biblical story as our lens. Does that make sense? So, the person that's going to help us explore those kinds of things today is a gal by the name of Megan Almon. Yep. A number of years ago, she's done a lot of things. She was a gymnast at the University of Georgia. Yeah, are any University of Georgia fans here? Good, because I'm a Kentucky fan. Go Cats, right? But we're glad that she played that role. In addition, she's an award-winning journalist. About 10 years ago, though, she began to respond to some rumblings in her own heart to figure out ways how to take her love for journalism, her love for communication, all right, and to begin to point those things towards the kingdom, to see how she might use those God-given gifts in order to be a part of what God is doing in the world. She picked up a master's degree at Biola University in Christian apologetics, and she also began working with Life Training Institute, which is a group you're going to hear more about in these next couple of days, but they're the folks who are on the front lines advocating for life in the world. You're going to get an opportunity this evening to hear a little bit more about that message, 7 o'clock in Warner Mission 104, as she gathers to speak at the TFC for Life event this evening. But today she comes to begin to lay the groundwork. How can we as Christians allow God's Spirit to ignite the mind, to ignite our imaginations, so that we not only understand the gospel, but we see all of life through it and live faithfully into that vision that God has for us. I want to ask you as good TFC folk, let's welcome Megan Almon as she comes and shares with us this morning.
Good morning. All right. That was underwhelmed. Okay. I'm really going to need you guys to have a sense of adventure to go with me on this kind of mental adventure this morning. So can we at least say that we have a sense of adventure, and are we ready for this morning? Thank you. Otherwise, I'm just going to babble really nervously up here. That's just how it goes. So I had a professor one time who mentioned something that has always stuck with me about the culture that we live in. He said that we suffer from a syndrome of justa. I thought, what in the world is he talking about? But the more he got going, the more I began to see it. And you'll begin to see it in just a second. When I was a little girl and we would go to church gatherings, my dad tended to be pretty strict about how you would act in the sanctuary. Right? Like I wasn't allowed to chew gum in the sanctuary or eat candy. I wasn't allowed to run or like cross my legs on the pews or anything like that, right? I had to sit very properly because it was kind of a magical place. He'd be like, baby, this is God's house. So we do those kind of things. But as I've grown older, I've seen more and more how that's lost. And I've watched his kids run through the sanctuary. Not that that in itself is that big of a deal, but when you ask someone about it, they'll say, well, it's just a building, right? Or I've noticed that we tend more and more these days, as I've read studies and observed and looked at the world around me, and even am guilty of it myself, how we will take something like a meal, food that was given to us, intended to delight our senses, intended to be shared with other people. We'll say, well, it's just food. So we eat in our car or at our desk because we have other things to get onto and do. And I've noticed sometimes how we'll sit in church, and when there's liturgy in your church and you read things like the Apostles' Creed, or you're reciting the Lord's Prayer, they become just words. It's just something that you say. So we've lost something along the way. Have you guys seen that? You know what I'm talking about? It's just a. Yeah. We're missing the whole story because we're only getting part of it when we live life that way. One of my favorite stories growing up was Arthur, King Arthur and the Sword and the Stone. That movie was made in like 1963 by Disney. You guys ever seen that movie just by chance? Raise your hand if you know that cartoon I'm talking about. I love that cartoon. Okay, it's still legit. And my kids watch it, and I think it's awesome. But there's something about that story. Before Arthur draws that sword from the stone, in his own understanding of who he is, he's just a squire, just a boy, right? It's kind of like, I think of modern examples. It's kind of like Harry before Hogwarts, right? He's just a boy. Or kind of like, I have a 12-year-old daughter, so Mia before Genovia. Right, like she's just a girl. She's not a princess yet. It's like Peter Parker before the spider bite. Like what? Okay, maybe not. Point being, it's all over the place. We live in a disenchanted world now. That's a good Lewis word, a disenchanted world. My friend Paul Gould talks about this when he talks about cultural apologetics and how we can kind of re-enchant the culture around us. But disenchanted. We look at the world around us, which in reality is a God-soaked universe, and we kind of use words like ordinary, everyday, mundane, justa. That's what's happening. See, that's not the world that the ancients knew. The ancients lived in a God-soaked world. And even though the gods were all over the place and misnamed and not really real, according to my worldview, at any moment you could encounter an immortal in that world. It was a world for them that was filled with mystery and wonder. Magical world. And that is actually the world we live in, but we've lost something along the way. Like G.K. Chesterton says, in our sin we've grown old in some kind of way. Or the new Mary Poppins movie when Angela Lansbury tells Michael Banks, you've forgotten what it's like to be a child. Anybody seen that movie? It's awesome. I highly recommend it. Okay. Sorry, just ADD enough to go there. All right. We've lost something. And that justa thinking, that justa mindset kind of tends to bleed down into things that are deeper in our world. In the field that I work in bioethics, justa is clear and present in all that I see and touch and do when I'm studying the world around me. Because these days, to be just a human is not enough. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's also bled into faith, into religious thinking. And so when you talk about your faith in a world like this one, what you tend to run into is the mindset that someone like Jesus was just a man, just a good teacher. We tend to think about something like the Bible as just a book, and some will call it just a book of myths. And Christianity itself is just a religion, just a good moral system to teach to your children, justa, and on it goes. Men and women, the reality is we are in the middle of a battle. And you are being fired upon every day from every single direction. And this battle is every bit as real and as deadly as those that you study in your history books. You just don't always see it because it exists in the realm of ideas. But as the great Leonardo DiCaprio said, in the film Inception, ideas can be the most dangerous thing. And they actually got that right. Ideas can be the most dangerous thing because ideas have real-world consequences. And those consequences play themselves out in our day-to-day lives for both ourselves and those around us. Ideas like, to be just human is not enough. And the results are disastrous to the world that we live in, as we are seeing. We all can look around and say, hey, there's something wrong here. Paul knew that this was going to happen. He was aware of it all along. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where he's defending his own ministry, he talks about the importance, more or less, of loving God with our mind. He's talking about this war on ideas because he says that the weapons of our warfare are not weapons of the flesh. We don't carry around gladiator swords, but they are divinely powerful for the destruction of strongholds. Now, I think there he's talking about worldviews, sets of ideas that keep people from understanding who God is and what kind of world we live in. If you don't believe me, he goes on to say that our job is to tear down lofty opinions, ideas, raised up against the knowledge of God, and to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Ideas. They have consequences. And our culture right now is really struggling on this front because there are two key questions, and these are where we're going to camp out today and tomorrow. Two very important questions that our culture in particular is struggling to answer when it comes to the ideas that are being fired our way. One deals with the nature of truth itself. That's the one we're going to wrestle with today. What counts as real knowledge? When I talk about my faith out there, how come it's shut down? And I'm told that doesn't really count in the marketplace of ideas. The other question our culture is struggling to answer is one that's on the forefront for Christian apologists today, probably more than it ever has been before, because all along the question has been, who is God? And Christian apologists from the very beginning have been answering that question. But now we're looking at the question, what does it mean to be human? Because to be just human is not enough, apparently. And that's the question we're going to save for tomorrow. But let's look at that truth question today for the next few minutes I have with you. The first thing I want to do is address kind of the nature of truth, particularly religious and moral truth. I want to talk about that for just a minute. Talk about where we are culturally and how we got there, which is going to be a very broad, like 36,000-foot overview, because that's all we have time for. You're welcome. And then we're going to talk about what that means for you. So when it comes to the nature of truth, what I like to do is kind of take all this very serious talk, because it is serious, up into the abstract where we can think about it and mess with it for just a minute. You guys okay with that? We're going to talk about something that's very important to me, and that is ice cream, for just a second. How many of you have been to Atlanta? Now, I'm from Gainesville, Georgia, so I'm from just down the road. I've lived in Noonan for the past 15 years until May of last year. My husband and I moved to Colorado Springs because he works for Summit Ministries out there. It's all pretty wild and crazy. I'm in like the middle of a big adventure right now where all my books are like disorganized. Do you guys have any idea what it's like in the life of a nerd for your books to be completely disorganized? It's painful. Reeling it back in. All right, but in Atlanta, there is a little-known place, the Irwin Street Market, just down the street from the Martin Luther King Memorial, called Jake's Ice Cream and Sorbets. Yes, we can be friends. If you have been there, raise your hand. Jake's Ice Cream and Sorbets. All right, I'm going to make a claim about Jake's because I will let the rest of you know this. When you walk in that place, if you can find it, it's basically a religious experience. They make everything on site from scratch, like all of it. The ice cream, the cone, all of it. So here's my claim. Jake's salted caramel ice cream in a waffle cone. Just take a moment for silent reflection on that. Is the best dessert on the face of the planet. How many of you think that's a true statement? Raise your hand. Cool, like one. All right. Just out of curiosity, is anybody offended that I think that's true? I'm serious. Ice cream and college football. I got you. All right. I'm serious about those too. Let's try another claim. Jake's salted caramel ice cream in a waffle cone is the cure for juvenile diabetes. Raise your hand if you think that's true. Don't raise your hand. Good job. Toccoa Falls College is doing an excellent job with you all. Notice, I did not raise my hand either for that second claim. Now, this may seem elementary, but I'm going somewhere with this, so stay with me. If I ask you the difference between those two claims, it's pretty obvious to most of you. You're going to think, well, one was an opinion, one was wrong, right? But I want to define them very carefully because it's pertinent to what we're talking about. The first claim told you something about me. I'm the subject, just like the subject of a sentence. It was a subjective claim. Now, subjective truths are truths that you, the subject, create. They're about you. And because you create them, they are matters of personal preference, like choosing one flavor of ice cream over another flavor. And because you create them, all subjective truths are equally valid. Because my favorite flavor has no more authority than your favorite flavor. Are you with me so far? That's why you weren't really offended by the first claim. Now, the second claim, which sounded crazy, was not about me at all. Now, maybe you could infer from that I need to study the workings of the pancreas a little closer, right? But it was about the objects in question. In this case, we had the ice cream and its relationship to diabetes. It was an objective kind of claim, not about me. Objective truths exist independently of the subject, which means they're true apart from me. They're true whether I prefer them or not. They're true whether I'm even aware of them or not. Objective truths are things that you discover, not things that you create. And by their very nature, an objective claim, like the one I made, can be right or wrong. It can be true or false. Are you with me so far? All right. We live in a world that thinks that religious and moral and value claims, like things about beauty, are subjective in nature. In other words, when I say something like Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross and 3 days later got up from the dead, and when I use this in audiences of high school students around the country and I ask them what kind of claim is that, I will usually get at least 50% of the room, if not more, who reply subjective. And I speak in Christian schools. How did we get here? I mean, does this resonate with you guys? Have any of you ever tried to make a case for something that you stand for as a Christian and you've been told that's your truth? Yeah, we're soaked in a culture of moral relativism that has just penetrated everything because of this kind of thinking. But where in the world did it come from? Well, we can actually look and see that in part it is a consequence of ideas, because ideas have consequences. So this is our 30,006-foot view. Let's take a step back and look and say, how did we get here? Now, there are many reasons as to why we got here. Sin is one of them. And none of us are free of that. Okay, the another is boredom, apathy, what Blaise Pascal called diversions that we fill our lives with. But if we trace back the ideas from history and take just a brief glance, we can see that in that tapestry, which is very complex, there are some major strands that run through it that you can follow and see how did we get to where we are now. What I'd like to do just very briefly is look at one of the major breaks that happened in Western thought. I want to go back to the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, we could go even farther back than that and trace the ideas as they trickle down. And those of you who are studying philosophy or history, dig in there, because you'll see it. You'll go, there's the strand. Oh, my goodness. And it has all these little fissures that run off of it. But if we look at that time, what we have is this huge surge in scientific advancement and technological advancement. It was pretty impressive. Lots of good stuff, like penicillin. That's really good. I'm glad of that. Lots of good things came out of the Enlightenment, but there's also some bad. Because with technological advances, you always have unintended consequences. And one of the things that came out of it was the thinking that since human beings can do all of these great things, we don't really need God to explain it anymore. Now, skepticism had already kind of taken root at this point in time. So again, like I said, it's more complex than just one thing. But this was a decisive break, because what happened in the minds of people like Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, who were atheists, is that the hard sciences became the basis for all of reality. When that happened, all these isms began to pop up. You've heard of some of them. With David Hume, it was empiricism, right? Materialism, naturalism, rationalism. All these isms. What they essentially were saying is that these facts that we can study with our senses, which is what empirically means, your five senses, you can see it, touch it, taste it, hear it, smell it. If you can do that, you can know it. But if you can't study something empirically, then you can't know that thing anymore. Not really. Well, what do you think that did to things like religious thinking, morality, beauty? Can you know those things empirically? Can you put the scientific method on whether something is morally right and wrong? Not so much. And so there came a huge split in thinking. And what happened from that is that the facts, the sciences, those were deemed the realm of the knowable. Those were the public things. Those were the things that everyone could discuss and agree on. But those other things were kind of shoved into the realm of this shadowy, unknowable place. How many artists do I have in the room? Yeah, you can trace it in the arts too. So if you study something like what came from that period, like Impressionism, you see the edges of reality literally began to blur. That's what happened to thinking too. We are consequences of those ideas. They're still deeply rooted in the way that people think, in the way that Christians think. One of my challenges to you would be to assess the way that you approach the world and see if you're doing this in some way, if you've bought this lie, or if you've bought Hume's premise, because many, many did. It's as if we took the floodlight. You guys remember, if you study history enough, you know theology was the queen of the sciences. It was like looking at the world with a floodlight, and you saw all of the connections and all of the wonder and all of what the world had to offer, even the world in the university. And in making it more efficient, which it certainly did, it took that floodlight and made it into a laser beam. So you might see one thing very clearly, but you miss all the rest. That can be dangerous. That's like taking Arthur's sword away from him, just a squire. Justa. And we lose the idea that the world is God-soaked and wonderful. We took the uni out of the university. And we wonder why students who were raised in Christian homes who've been told this is what is true all their lives go to school, go to a secular university campus perhaps, and then they're told that this true knowledge that they bring to the table isn't part of the methodology. Sorry, doesn't count. We wonder why they question and even walk away. And we wonder why math majors have a hard time sitting at the table with English majors. Justa. G.K. Chesterton said, "The world will never starve of want of wonders, but it will starve for want of wonder. If all we see with is a laser beam." So here's where we are now. Christianity is not allowed in the marketplace of ideas, says the order that is accepted that science is the basis of all reality. But men and women, can science tell us empirically why science is the basis of all reality? No, it cannot. Everyone does metaphysics. Everyone. There's just a different religion on top today. Fact of the matter is, Christianity is a fully orbed, robust worldview. It is a view of reality that accounts for all that science accounts for and all that it doesn't. It explains even the things that don't really make sense to us. We look at the world and we think we've got it figured out until something quirky comes up, and we find that Christianity has room for that. Chesterton mentioned in his book Orthodoxy that what if an alien had come to Earth and he had seen one of you sitting there? He might immediately surmise that human beings are perfectly symmetrical creatures, yes? He would look at you and he would see, well, you've got 2 nostrils and 2 eyes and 2 ears and 2 arms and 2 legs. And then he would cut you open down the middle. This is all weird. It's just an example, okay? And he would find on the inside, well, you've got 2 kidneys and 2 lungs and 2 rib cages. Oh, this is all very fascinating. And so he would automatically assume that he would find the heart dead in the center where he could divide it evenly down the middle. And that's right where he would be wrong. There are some odd things in life that don't quite fall into the perfect order, but Christianity has room for that too. And it makes sense even of that. C.S. Lewis figured it out. He figured out that the laser beam wasn't enough when he said, I see Christianity as I see that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. When it comes to Christianity, it counts as true knowledge. When I make a claim about who Jesus is, men and women, I'm not talking about myself. When I make the claim that abortion is wrong, which is what I argue regularly around the country, I'm not talking about my preferences. It's an objective kind of claim, and it can be investigated in the marketplace of ideas. It counts as true knowledge. There's just too much to the universe for it to be any other way. If we follow the evidence where it leads, what we see is that there is evidence of design dripping from every corner of the universe as far as it extends, all the way down to the cellular level, all the way down to the particles. And the digger they deep, the more they find that at the very bottom is, guess what? Information. Because it all comes from a mind much greater than ours. Just follow the evidence where it leads. Einstein did. It made him really mad. Human beings are rational, willful, dignified, wonderful creatures who bear the image of their Maker. The central tenet of our faith, the resurrection, the thing that Paul shoved all of the stakes to the middle of the table. He's the best gambler I've ever met, or the worst, right? Paul's a gambler, she's a heretic. All the chips on the table. 1 Corinthians 15, when he said the resurrection, if it happened, we're right, but if it didn't, then we are of most people, we are the most to be pitied. And yet, the historical reasons, the philosophical evidence, the scientific evidence, the medical evidence that supports the resurrection provide a better explanation of the events of that day in history than anything naturalism has ever brought to the table. Anything. Because Jesus really did die, and then he really did get up. And in doing so, he really did make a joke out of sin and death. That's an amazing thing. It gives us confidence in the way that we can talk about our faith to the world, because it does count. For those who are willing to set aside their predispositions or presuppositions and listen and follow the evidence where it leads. And when you can graciously show them that, you've done a great service. And because it is an objective kind of truth, one that by its very claim, by its very nature can be right or wrong, true or false, just by saying it, that puts you in a very humble position, Christian. Because when you make the statement, the truth or falsity of it doesn't fall on you. And when someone attacks Christianity, they're not attacking you personally. That frees you up to be able to be curious about not only that person and go, well, that's an interesting thing that you just said. Can I ask you more about that? And suddenly you're in dialogue, and suddenly you're following the evidence. But it also frees you up to be curious about the world around you and how wonderful that world is. Because Christianity, when properly understood, touches everything that you do, from your waking up in the morning to your brushing your teeth to your choosing your outfit, to your sitting in class, to my daughter's doing long division. God help her. I know it does. I don't know how yet, but I know it touches that too. No, I'm just kidding. 2 + 2 is 4. I don't know the alternative to that. It seems to work because the world makes sense. It touches your relationships. It touches the way you think about morality and the way that you think about the issues the world is facing right now. It touches all of it. The stories that you read and the films that you watch. And you are free, again, to be curious about this world. When Dorothy Sayers talks about Jesus and describes the character that he is, she said, the people who hanged Christ never to do them justice accused him of being a bore. On the contrary, they thought him too dynamic to be safe. It has been left for later generations to muffle up that shattering personality. She goes on to describe some of the things that he did. He called religious leaders heretics. He called the leading authority of that day, King Herod, a fox. He wove a whip and drove businessmen out of the temple and their things, and he tended to cure diseases by any means that came necessary, she says, with a surprising casualness towards people's pigs and property. If this is dull, then what in God's name do we call exciting, she says. It's not justa. So I'll leave you with this thought that Annie Dillard puts forth about what exactly is that Christians are doing in their churches. Don't you understand that we're spies? Plotting a revolution against the prince of this world? Because we live in a God-soaked universe, and it's real. And we can think about it this way. Annie Dillard says, why do people in the churches seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour of the absolute? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? The churches are children, playing in the floor with chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It's madness for ladies to wear ladies' hats and velvet hats to churches. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, for sleeping God may wake someday and draw us out to where we can never return. Indeed, Aslan is not a tame lion, and this thing we call Christianity is infinite, literally infinite depths of intellectual fulfillment. But not only does it fulfill our minds in that way, it ignites the imagination in ways that we cannot even imagine. There's a play on words. Christians, you are not justa. You are Arthur drawing the sword from the stone, because the same Holy Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead truly, objectively lives in you. Let's pray. Abba, Father, we come before you today, and we ask that you forgive us. We ask you forgive us for looking at the world with a laser beam. And we ask that you give us Jesus' eyes, that we may see the world as he sees the world, both when he was walking among us and even now. We thank you, God, that you provided a rescue. We thank you for the Holy Spirit who truly paves the way. God, we are capable of so much. And I pray that just as we do not hide a light under the basket, that our lights, God, of who you are and the wonder of the world around us, that would shine forth in the way that we live our lives and the things we do and choose and say and study. It's in Christ's holy name I pray. Amen.
Not bad. I want to invite you this evening, Warner Mission 104 at 7 o'clock, to join the folks of TFC for Life, to come and to hear Megan share again around those kinds of very issues. And then we'll come back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. To talk about similar issues tomorrow. As you go from this place, let's be people who prepare our minds for action. Let's do that together here at TFC. Go in God's power and His grace.